I bought a gun the day after my son-in-law threatened me, but the weapon I actually used to destroy him was far more silent and infinitely more effective. It wasn't supposed to end like this. I had spent 45 years as a high school principal in the chaotic, concrete sprawl of Chicago. My life had been measured in bell schedules, disciplinary hearings, budget cuts, and the relentless noise of 3,000 teenagers. Every dollar I saved, every vacation I skipped, every luxury I denied myself was for a singular, shining vision, a log cabin deep in the Smoky Mountains of Tennessee. I wanted a place where the only arguments were between the wind and the hemlock trees, where the only schedule was the rising and setting of the sun. When I finally signed the deed to the property at 68 years old, I felt a physical unburdening, as if gravity itself had released its hold on my spine. The cabin was named Whispering Pines. It was a modest structure of hand-hewn timber, sitting on 6 acres of lush, rolling woodland that bordered a national forest. It had 2 bedrooms, a stone hearth that smelled of wood smoke even when cold, and a wraparound porch that offered a front-row seat to the mist rolling off the mountains. To the rest of the world, it was just a house. To me, it was the finish line of a marathon I had been running since I was 22. "Welcome home, Mrs. Vance," the realtor had said, handing me a heavy brass key. "You've got no neighbors for 2 miles in any direction. Just you and the bears." I drove up the winding gravel driveway that first evening, watching the bars on my cell phone drop one by one until the screen simply read, "No service." It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. I parked my rugged SUV, stepped onto the crushed stone, and wept. I wasn't crying from sadness. I was crying because for the first time in my life, I belonged entirely to myself. The first month was a baptism of peace. I woke up with the dawn. I drank my coffee on the porch, watching the wild turkeys trot across the lawn and listening to the chorus of tree frogs. I spent my days hiking the perimeter of my land, learning the names of the wildflowers and the habits of the red-tailed hawks. At night, I read books by the fire, sipping bourbon, feeling the silence wrap around me like a warm quilt. It was paradise. It was everything I had promised myself during those long, headache-filled days in the city. Then the phone rang. I had to drive 10 minutes down the mountain to a specific overlook just to get a signal. I had gone there to check my email, but the device buzzed in my hand. It was Sarah, my only daughter. "Mom, thank God," she said, her voice tight and breathless. "We have a situation." My stomach tightened. The principal in me braced for impact. "What is it, Sarah? Are the girls okay?" "The girls are fine. It's Greg's parents, Arthur and Beatrice." I frowned. Greg had been my son-in-law for 12 years. He was a man of expensive tastes and slippery charm, a commercial real estate agent who always seemed to be chasing the next big deal. His parents were wealthy, aloof people who had always looked down on my public service career with polite disdain. "What about them?" I asked. "They lost the townhouse, Mom. The investment firm they were using. It was a scheme. It's all gone. The bank took the property this morning." "That's terrible," I said, and I meant it. Losing a home is a trauma I wouldn't wish on anyone. "I'm so sorry to hear that. They have nowhere to go," Sarah continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. Greg says they're coming to stay with you." The silence that stretched between us was heavy with the static of a weak signal. "Excuse me?" I asked, my voice dangerously calm. "Just for a few months, until they get on their feet," Sarah rushed on. "Greg is already packing their things. They'll be there on Tuesday. Sarah, this is a 2-bedroom cabin. I bought this place to be alone. I am 68 years old. I am not running a bed and breakfast for Arthur and Beatrice." "Mom, please, they are family." "Greg is freaking out. He says if you don't help, you're being cruel." "I am not being cruel. I am being retired," I snapped. "This isn't a structurally sound environment for 2 elderly people with mobility issues. The driveway is steep. The nearest hospital is 40 minutes away." "Sarah, listen to me. Just talk to Greg," she said. And before I could protest, the phone was fumbled, and Greg's voice boomed through the speaker. "Evelyn," he didn't ask, he stated. "My parents will be there Tuesday. It's the only option. Unless, of course, you want to move back to Chicago and let them have the cabin. Your old condo is still on the market." The audacity took the air out of my lungs. "Greg, you cannot just commandeer my home. They are moving in, Evelyn. If you don't like it, leave. You always said you wanted to help family. Put your money where your mouth is." The call dropped. The signal faded. I stood on that overlook, staring at the majestic, indifferent mountains, shaking with rage. It wasn't a request. It was an invasion. They hadn't asked. They had informed. I drove back to my sanctuary, feeling the peace evaporate. I walked through the rooms, touching the rough-hewn logs, looking at the vintage quilt draped over the sofa. This was mine. I had bled for this. And now, two people who had barely spoken 10 words to me in a decade were coming to occupy it, sent by a son-in-law who treated me like an ATM with a pulse. That night, I didn't sleep. I paced the floorboards. The easygoing grandmother, the patient educator, she retired that night. In her place, a strategist woke up. I grabbed a yellow legal pad and a pen. I sat at the kitchen table as the moon rose over the ridge. I wouldn't scream. I wouldn't fight them physically. I would make them leave of their own volition. If they wanted a war in the wilderness, they were about to learn that I was the apex predator on this mountain. I needed intelligence first. Why would Arthur and Beatrice, people who prided themselves on their financial acumen, suddenly be destitute? Why was Greg so aggressive? I drove into the nearest town, Gatlinburg, the next morning and set up camp in a coffee shop with strong Wi-Fi. I called an old friend, Marcus, who worked in finance back in Chicago. "Marcus, I need you to look into something for me," quietly. 2 hours later, Marcus called back. "Evelyn, did you know Greg has been unemployed for 8 months? He was let go from the firm for ethical inconsistencies. And his parents? They didn't lose their money in a scheme last week. They lost it 2 years ago. They've been living in a rented condo paid for by Greg, who is currently drowning in debt." The picture clarified. This wasn't a sudden emergency. This was a collapse. My cabin wasn't a guest house. It was an asset. They were moving in to establish residency. Once they were in, getting them out would be a legal nightmare. They wanted to push me out, sell the place, or leverage it. Next, I called Mr. Henderson, a real estate attorney in Knoxville recommended by my realtor. "Legally, Mrs. Vance, possession is 9/10 of the law," Henderson warned. "If you let them move in and establish mail delivery, they become tenants, even without a lease. Evicting family is messy. Do you have your deed secure?" "I have everything," I said. "I own it free and clear. Do not leave the property," he advised. "If you leave, they can change the locks. Stay put. Document everything." I thanked him and hung up. I wasn't going to leave, but I also wasn't going to make them comfortable. I went to the local hardware store, the gardening center, and a specialty hunting shop. "Having trouble with pests, ma'am?" the clerk at the hunting shop asked, as I placed several items on the counter. "You could say that," I smiled tightly. "Invasive species." I bought synthetic skunk scent, usually used by hunters to mask their smell or attract predators. I bought snake repellent and, strangely, a bag of rubber snakes that looked terrifyingly realistic. I bought harmless but foul-smelling organic fertilizer. I bought high-frequency noise emitters designed to deter rodents, but annoying to human ears if set correctly. Back at the cabin, I went to work. I treated the guest room, the room they would occupy, with the special touches. I placed the rubber snakes in shadows. One under the bed, just visible, another coiled behind the curtains. I adjusted the water heater to its lowest setting. I tampered with the flow restrictor on the showerhead in the guest bath so the water would come out as a pathetic drizzle. I sprinkled the fertilizer heavily in the flower beds right under the guest bedroom window. It smelled like a barnyard that hadn't been cleaned in a decade. Then I waited. On Tuesday afternoon, a dusty sedan rolled up the driveway. Greg was driving. Sarah was in the passenger seat, looking pale. In the back, Arthur and Beatrice looked like they were being driven to a prison execution. I met them on the porch, wearing my best hostess smile. "Welcome," I called out. "You made good time." Greg got out of the car, looking around with a sneer. "Roads are terrible up here. You really need to pave this driveway, Evelyn." "It's rustic," I said cheerfully. "Hello, Sarah." Sarah hugged me, her body rigid. "Hi, Mom. Thanks for doing this," she whispered in my ear. I'm sorry. Arthur and Beatrice emerged, dressed in clothes far too expensive for the woods. Beatrice's heels sank immediately into the soft earth. Good heavens, Beatrice muttered, wrinkling her nose. What is that stench? Oh, that's the mountain air, I lied effortlessly. We have a lot of wild sulfur springs nearby, and I just fertilized the hydrangeas with local manure. It's excellent for the soil. You get used to it after a few weeks. Weeks? Arthur groaned. Come on in. I ushered them inside. The interior of the cabin was beautiful, but I had made sure it felt exposed. I had removed the curtains in the living room, letting the dark woods press against the glass. This is it? Greg asked, looking around the cozy living area. It looked bigger in the photos. It's 1,200 square feet of bliss, I said. Now, let me show you to your room. I led Arthur and Beatrice to the guest room. I opened the door, and the smell of the fertilizer wafted in through the window I had cracked open for fresh air. Beatrice walked in, dropped her bag, and then screamed. It was a high, piercing sound that sent birds flying from the trees. Snake! There's a snake! She was pointing a trembling finger under the bed. I leaned down, grabbed the rubber tail, and pulled it out. I didn't reveal it was fake. I just tossed it casually out the window. Oh, that's just a black rat snake, I said nonchalantly. They're everywhere this time of year. They come in for the warmth. Totally harmless. Well, mostly. Just check your shoes before you put them on. Scorpions like the shoes. Scorpions? Arthur asked, his face draining of color. Welcome to the Smokies, I beamed. That night was a disaster for them, and a triumph for me. I served a dinner of extremely spicy chili, claiming it was a local delicacy. Greg spent the evening pacing the porch, trying to get a cell signal, and failing. Beatrice and Arthur sat on the sofa, flinching every time the house settled or a branch scraped the window. The water is brown, Beatrice complained later, emerging from the bathroom. Iron deposits, I called out from the kitchen. Good for the blood. I went to bed early, locking my bedroom door loudly. I lay in the dark, listening. Around 2 a.m., I triggered the remote for the noise emitter I had hidden in the attic above their room. It was a low, scratching sound, like a large animal digging. I heard Beatrice shriek. Arthur, something is in the ceiling. It's probably just a raccoon, I heard Arthur hiss. Go back to sleep. It sounds like a bear. I smiled at the ceiling and drifted off to sleep. The next morning, the mood in the kitchen was funeral. Arthur looked like he hadn't slept in a week. Beatrice was wearing sunglasses indoors. Greg was agitated. We need to talk about the living arrangements, Greg said, slamming his hand on the table. This isn't sustainable. My parents can't live with snakes and brown water. I told you it was rustic, I said, pouring coffee. If they aren't happy, there's a lovely motel 6 inches Gatlinburg. We are not staying in a motel, Greg snapped. We are staying here. But changes need to be made. We need to renovate. Enlarge the master suite for them. Pave the drive. Get satellite internet. And who is paying for that? I asked. We'll figure it out. Greg waved his hand dismissively. We can take a loan against the equity. There it was. The truth. The equity? I asked, my voice dropping an octave. You mean my equity? It's family assets, Evelyn. Don't be selfish. I looked at Sarah. She was staring at her coffee cup, refusing to meet my eyes. She was broken, beaten down by this man's bullying. I have to go into town, I said, standing up. I have errands. You all make yourselves at home. Watch out for the wasps on the porch. I drove straight to Henderson's office. They're digging in, I told him. He mentioned taking a loan against the equity. Henderson nodded grimly. We need to lock this down. I've drafted a document affirming your mental competency and your exclusive ownership. I also suggest we put the property into an irrevocable trust, naming your daughter as the beneficiary only upon your death, with strict clauses that prevent the property from being used as collateral. But we need to get Greg out. I'm working on it, I said. But I need more. I hired a private investigator Henderson knew, a man named Caleb, who looked more like a lumberjack than a detective. Find out who Greg owes money to, I told him, and find out how deep the hole is. When I returned to the cabin that afternoon, I found Arthur and Beatrice sitting in the car with the engine running and the AC blasting. They refused to go back inside. There was a spider the size of a dinner plate, Beatrice sobbed through the window. And the toilet won't flush. I had turned off the water main before I left. Oh dear, I said. Well, pump must be acting up. Might be days before we get it fixed. Greg came storming out of the house. You are doing this on purpose. Doing what, Greg? Living my life? I told you this place wasn't a resort. We are going to stay, he hissed, leaning into my face. And eventually, you're going to realize that you're too old to manage this place. And when that happens, I'll be here to take the burden off your hands. It was a threat. A clear, direct threat of guardianship. He was going to try to declare me incompetent. I needed to escalate. That night, I staged the grand finale of The Haunting. I had bought a high-powered projector. Once the lights were out, I projected the silhouette of a massive bear walking past the guest room window, accompanied by the sounds of heavy growling played through a Bluetooth speaker hidden in the bushes. Inside the room, it sounded like a grizzly was trying to eat the house. Beatrice didn't just scream. She wailed. We are leaving. Arthur, take me to the city. I don't care if we sleep on the street. By breakfast the next morning, the bags were packed. We can't do it, Greg, Arthur said, his hands shaking as he held his coffee mug. My heart can't take it. The noise, the animals, the water. It's hell. Greg was furious. He looked at me with pure hatred. Fine. We'll take them to the condo in Chicago. But this isn't over, Evelyn. Wait, I said, dropping the bait I had prepared. If you guys are going back to Chicago, my old condo hasn't sold yet. It's empty. It's fully furnished. Why don't you stay there for a few months? Just until you settle things. Greg stopped. He looked at Sarah, then at me. His greed was warring with his pride. Greed won. That would be acceptable, he said stiffly. I'll call the realtor and tell them to pull the listing for now, I said. Go ahead. The keys are with the doorman. They left within the hour. As the dust settled on the driveway, I felt a wave of relief, but it was short-lived. I walked back into the house and began cleaning up the rubber snakes and the scents. On the coffee table, buried under a stack of magazines, I found a folder Greg had left behind in his haste. I opened it. My blood ran cold. It was a power of attorney form, already filled out with my name, granting Greg full control over my finances and medical decisions. Next to it was a filled-out application for a senior guardianship hearing, citing dementia and squalid living conditions. He had even forged a signature from a Dr. Evans. He hadn't just come for the house. He had come to erase me. I called Sarah immediately. Mom, we're on the highway. She sounded exhausted. Sarah, you need to come back here. Alone. Tell Greg you forgot your medication or something. Just come back. I can't. Sarah, I found the papers. He's trying to have me committed. He forged a doctor's signature. There was a long silence. Then a sob. I'll be there tonight. Sarah arrived at midnight. She looked 10 years older than her age. We sat on the porch, wrapped in blankets. I didn't know about the guardianship. She wept. I knew about the money. He owes. Mom, he owes bad people. Loan sharks. He used our house in the suburbs as collateral without telling me. We lost it. That's why we had to move. He saw your cabin as the only asset left to leverage. He was going to lock me away, I said softly. I'm so sorry. I was so scared, he said. He said if I didn't help him, he'd take the girls. He said I was an unfit mother because of my depression history. I took her hand. He is a predator, Sarah, and we are going to stop him. The next day, Caleb the investigator called. Mrs. Vance, your son-in-law is in deep. He owes $200,000 to a syndicate in Chicago. But here's the kicker. He's also wanted for fraud in Illinois for that real estate deal he got fired over. There's a warrant coming. We had the ammunition. Now we needed to fire the shot. I had Sarah call Greg. She put it on speaker. Where are you? Greg barked. You've been gone all night. I'm at Mom's, Sarah said, her voice shaking but determined. I'm not coming to Chicago, Greg, and neither are my parents-in-law. Mom sold the condo this morning to a cash buyer. The locks have been changed. You what? Greg screamed. And Greg, I leaned into the phone. I have the guardianship papers you left. I have the forgery. I have the report from the private investigator about your debts and the fraud warrant. You old witch, he spat. You have no idea who you're messing with. I think I do, I said calmly. I'm messing with a desperate man who is out of options. Here is the deal. You will sign the divorce papers Sarah is sending. You will assume all marital debt. You will sign a restraining order, keeping you away from this property and from Sarah and the girls. If you do that, I won't hand the forgery evidence to the district attorney. I'll let the Illinois police find you on their own time. I'll come down there, he threatened. I'll burn that cabin to the ground. I wouldn't do that, I said. I have armed security on the property now, and the local sheriff is a personal friend. He hung up. The next 3 days were a siege. I hired Caleb to stay on the property. We installed cameras. Sarah was a wreck, terrified Greg would show up. He didn't show up, but his creditors did. 2 nights later, the motion sensors at the bottom of the driveway tripped. Caleb woke us up. 2 men, SUV, not law enforcement. We watched on the monitors as the men approached the gate. They looked around, saw the cameras, saw the sign warning of armed security, and had a discussion. Then they got back in their car and left. They weren't looking for you, Caleb said. They were looking for assets. They realized this place is a fortress. Greg was arrested 4 days later in a motel in Kentucky. He had been trying to flee south. The police picked him up on the fraud warrant. With him in custody, the house of cards collapsed. Sarah filed for divorce. The loan sharks, realizing Greg was in prison and had no assets, moved on to easier prey. The war was over. But the healing was just beginning. Sarah didn't move back to Chicago. She couldn't. She had nothing left there. She and my granddaughters, Mia and Lily, moved into the cabin with me temporarily. I ruined your retirement, Sarah said one evening, watching the girls chase fireflies in the yard. No, I said. You saved me from being a lonely old woman who talks to rubber snakes. We found a small house for Sarah in the town nearby. She got a job teaching at the local elementary school. The girls fell in love with the mountains. They traded their iPads for hiking boots. And me? I realized that my dream of solitude was just a reaction to the noise of my past life. Total silence is beautiful, but the sound of my granddaughters laughing on the porch was better. 6 months later, I received a letter. It was handwritten, on cheap paper. It was from Arthur. Dear Evelyn, I am writing this from a small apartment in Ohio, where Beatrice and I are now living. We are surviving on our Social Security. It is a humble life, one we probably deserve. I wanted to apologize. We were desperate, and we allowed our desperation to make us complicit in Greg's cruelty. We knew he wanted your house. We didn't know about the guardianship, but we knew he planned to push you out. We were so afraid of being homeless that we were willing to make you homeless. That is a shame I will carry to my grave. You fought for your home. I admire that. I hope you find peace in your mountains. Sincerely, Arthur. I folded the letter and put it in my Bible. I didn't hate them anymore. I just felt a profound pity for people who had built their lives on the shifting sands of status and money, only to find themselves drowning when the tide came in. Spring came to the Smokies. The dogwoods exploded in white blossoms. I started a project I called the Silver Pines Collective. I bought the 10 acres adjacent to my property. With the help of the community, Paul the lawyer, Caleb the security expert, and Sarah, we started building small, sustainable cottages. The idea was simple: a sanctuary for independent seniors. A place where people could live with dignity in their own homes, but with a support network. No one would ever be isolated. No one would ever be vulnerable to a predator like Greg because they had nowhere else to turn. I stood on the porch one evening, 2 years after the invasion. The sun was setting, painting the sky in violets and golds. Sarah was in the garden, showing Mia how to plant tomatoes. The air smelled of pine and damp earth. I had bought this house to escape the world. But in defending it, I had found my place within it. I realized then the lesson that 40 years of education hadn't taught me, but one winter in the woods had. You cannot build a sanctuary by shutting people out. True safety doesn't come from locks or isolation or even from owning a deed free and clear. True safety comes from the community you build, the family you defend, and the courage to stand your ground when the wolves come to the door. I took a sip of my wine, listened to the wind in the treetops, and finally, truly, rested. If you enjoyed this story, please hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments, what would you have done in my shoes? And don't forget to check out the members-only area for more stories from the mountains.